The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
This is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss, and I am happy to welcome you back to Movement 2 of Symphonie Fantastique in our months-long exploration of this intense, wonderfully orchestrated work. So, we left off with some beautiful glittering harps and strings and winds, kind of bringing a phrase to a close right on the 5, so that E major, or E7, so you could imagine the music going right back to the theme or in some way going back to the tonic. However, Berlioz is not happy to just make this simple. He likes to inject little episodes, little phrases that complicate things and express something on his mind, like some obsessive quality or rumination. So in this case, we have flutes and clarinet, first clarinet and first flute, playing octaves here. Ba-ba-ba-dum, ba-ba-ba-dum. And the horns are answering from below. Now remember, this is transposing down a minor sixth rather than a major sixth. So you could sort of do the calculation here and think, well, that must be a B then, rather than a B flat with the E flat transposition. However, remember my little trick that I taught you last lecture, which is to imagine that there is a bass clef here and a key signature of E major, E major, and then there is a ottava mark. So if that were the case, then this would be octave Bs, right? So starting on the second B below middle C, and then, of course, so in other words, this would be bass clef an octave higher. Now, what do you do when you get to like a C flat? How do you interpret flats on an E horn? Well, in this case, in other words, C flat in bass clef, if you were thinking about it that way. Well, in this case, I would say just think up like a half step, right? So think of the flat as a natural, and then you've got it, right? So this would be the equivalent of C in E, or excuse me, the equivalent transposing sounding C, even though if we have our imaginary bass clef and sharps here, right? So just think of the flat as being a natural. There are some other tricks to it too, but too much to go over here. Now, while this call and response is happening, notice that this is stepping down a half step to B, and this is starting on B and going up a half step to the same C, of course, a couple octaves lower. So while this little kind of game is going on here between the winds and horns, the strings are playing this lovely little figure in the back. And it's not just the violins on top, but kind of in a little bit of contrary motion. The same exact figure is being played by the cellos, only 2 beats later. Or, since the beat is really on the downbeat of each measure, It would be on the third eighth note of each bar, to be really precise about it. But yeah, it's alternating in this really lovely way. And then we've got pizzicato second violins and violas in the middle, just sort of filling in the harmony. And they also have a little bit of a pattern to them too. It's not one sort of playing off of the other or anything like that, but they're just working together inside here to fill in what's going on between the firsts and the cellos. It's just really a lovely passage, and especially a little bit unexpected, right? That's the one thing that's great about Berlioz. You know, he is so much more modern. He is so far ahead of the middle classical period, which to an extent was dominated by Haydn. Let's face it. But Haydn was one of those people who not only helped to forge what the sound was for that entire era, but he was always subverting it, right? He was the king of the surprise. And I think that lesson has been learned here by Berlioz and by other great composers of the day. I think you also see some of that in, say, Weber, and of course in Schubert and Schumann. But what's just really lovely is how Berlioz will pull out the rug from under your expectations and send you to a different place. Just so beautifully, too, just so elegantly. And then you come to expect those changes, right? And then you're not satisfied with the old way of doing things. A very, very sneaky way of forcing the listener to a position of loving this new romantic kind of music, if you could just accept it, right? And just say, oh, that's just a bunch of hogwash. And, you know, I have had students who have just been locked into Mozart and Haydn and so on and so forth, and they just don't want to move forwards. Like, even today in the 21st century, where they might go to a movie and hear all kinds of very strange chord progressions and atonal music and accept that, you know, just because it was part of the movie. But then when they sit down for their concert music listening, they really want, like very traditional resolutions and chord progressions and melodies and everything else going back to the classical period. And in their own writing, that reflects that too. It's just a phase a lot of composers go through, and some people never leave that area. And I think that that's great because they really explore it, and they, you know, it's as if they were living 2.5 centuries ago and becoming a part of that culture. That's you know, look, you can do whatever you want to with music, and I think that that's great. But yeah, I've had people react to Berlioz even today, is what I'm trying to say. React in a way that really, you know, they feel the revolution because they're so locked into the classical period. All right, so after our little game, we end up right here, which is just really, really lovely. These rising harps. Notice that Berlioz is giving the harps plenty of space here. He has some of these pitches are pizzicato, or they end early in the flutes and horns and clarinet. So you can really hear this push right in here by the harps, especially if they're right at the front of the stage. I mean, not every orchestra can afford to set up their stage that way with stereo harps that are double on both sides. And then just a little reaction afterwards in contrary motion. It's really, really nice, going to opposite directions. Same thing, just sort of a oomph, and then dying off with the harps pushing into it. And at the same time, you have these lovely high held notes here. So 2 Ds by our first flute and first oboe player, and then an octave lower, the first clarinet. Now you're looking at that and saying, hey, that's an F, Thomas. But remember, we're in A, right? So think down a minor third. And then you've got it, right? And then our winds just walk down in octaves here, this lovely little scale. And this right in here is a quote from the previous little figure that the violins were doing, right? They were going da 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 da. So here we're going da 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 da. Right? So it is just a little bit of an artifact that helps to tie things together. And then right here is lovely. We are going to the 4 chord. So it's just so fun. What Berlioz is doing here, he has a perfectly acceptable 5 chord setup, right, for 5/7 chord, and he could just go right to the 1, right, but he decides to go to the 4, and then a 6/4 1 chord, right, and then to the 5, and then to the 1. And this is another thing that he does a lot. He'll completely set up a cadence, like a really traditional 5/1 cadence, and then he'll just do something to it to delay when it's going to come in. And that's another kind of taste developer, right? I think he really knew what he was doing, despite the fact that he was writing this in sort of a feverish haze of yearning for his idée fixe, his compulsion over Harriet Smithson. He just put tons of genius into this work. So I just love that. I appreciate it. And to look at some of these chords, the way that they're scored, are just very simple and effective, and just a really good use. We're going to take a look at the voicing of these chords just very quickly, so it isn't just this big blur of black dots to you if you were a beginning orchestrator. So we've got the D at the bottom, D fifth in the cellos, and then a D third in our violas, right? So it's a nice little stack going up of something rooting in a D. And then we've got another D fifth with our second violins, and then on top we've got an F sharp. So just a beautifully voiced, just very full chord. The bottom is not too heavy, it's like octaves and fifths, and then we have a nice, beautiful triad with emphasis on the lower D, which of course, being an open string, is just very easy to play this as a as a double stop with both the seconds and the violas. I keep glancing over here and seeing altos. Okay, and then what's going on in our winds and brass? We've got the same D third being played in the clarinets that we're seeing here, right? You just have to change clefs and then think down a minor third. So if you see an F third, that's a D third. So we've got that happening. And then B flat, right? What is that? Down a minor sixth? Okay, well, it is a D, right? So we've got that extra emphasis on this nice rooting D here. And then up here, we have a D third in the flutes, and then just the F sharp right on top there in the oboe, right? So it's a very wonderfully effective chord with lots of emphasis on this D right here, and a lot of emphasis on this F sharp. And notice that it's just the first violins that walk down or skip down to this D here. So they get the melodic gesture over the harmony of everybody else, especially the winds. And that is a very classical era type of strategy, because you just really think of the strings as being the instruments that lead you here and there. That is something that kind of wore down towards the end of the Romantic period, especially under Wagner, and was just really liberated in the early modern period of the 20s and earlier. So Yeah, and then we've got the similar voicing, right? Except right here, the horns are going to Cs, right? Which, like, if anytime you see a C in a natural horn part, that means whatever tuning it is, right? So if these are E horns, then these written Cs are E, right? Down a minor sixth once again. So E octaves with E in the bass staff and E above middle C. That's what you're seeing right here. Okay, and then that's the same exact note as this cello E down here, and the viola's on top, right? And everybody's playing softly. That's really, really nice, right? So pretty much the same voicing is preserved, working not exactly in parallel motion, but pretty much in parallel motion in the winds and horns. Yeah, I'm saying that not exactly. It is parallel motion in the winds, but not in the horns, who are holding an E. And this is interesting that we've got A thirds in the violins, A and C sharp, and then G sharp and B, right? But who's got the upper pitch that the ear is going to stick to? And that is the flutes or the first flute and oboe. So it's just a lovely idea. You know what I mean? Is to get the strings to go under and then become more textural, even though they have been sort of leading this melody along, right? It's just such ingenious work as an orchestrator and as a composer. And of course, playing contrary motion wherever he can, like for instance the rising middle strings right in here, running up to E to sort of meet the winds running down. Just so lovely. And then he is right back to the main theme again. And so on. And that's pretty much exactly the way that it was originally stated. You'll notice these little dashed slurs occasionally, and that's just because Berlioz might have forgotten to write it in on the manuscript, and then the publisher said, "Oh, by the way, you're going to want to do it like this." But maybe Berlioz didn't want you to do that, and that's why he left it out. So you would just, in this case, bow each note, da 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 dum, instead of dum. Okay, but what else is going on here? Sorry about my scratchy throat. Okay, but what else is going on here? This wonderful idea of trading off between sections for his papa. All right, so he's got the in his strings, right, except for the firsts. And, just octaves in the cellos and basses, and then the violas and seconds in closer harmony sometimes. And the harps get the second eighth of each bar. Notice, gee, I don't know where all this gunk is coming from. Notice Soli on the harp, so he really wants them to bring out their chords, even though he's marking them piano. Right? Everybody is supposed to chill here. It's not supposed to return to the main theme with this sort of mighty expression, this big waltz. No, it's actually meant to be kind of delicate, right? It's the sense of ballroom dancing that you are being a gentleman to your partner, right? You are being supportive and you're guiding them, and you are, you're not being sauvage. You're not just like throwing them around the floor. I think that's kind of the sense here, is that you are kind of allowing them to express who they are, by being more gentle. I think that that's part of what's going on here. Not that Berlioz was a ballroom dancer, but he had a real keen eye for just the way things happened on that dance floor. I'm sure that he went to some soirees as a young man, or watched them from afar longingly, perhaps. So strings, harps solely, right? So nice, rich rolling chords, you would imagine, and then the winds and horns taking the third eighth, right? And just really lovely chord voicings once again. You've got right here, this is like an A tenth, so A on the bottom, C sharp on top. And then once again, horns in E major, so that's going to be a C sharp third. All right, if you think of your bass clef, and then you think of your key signature of E, and then you see this is a C sharp third up an octave, right? So it's actually forming a chord, forming a triad with the second clarinet, right? So you've got your root, your third, and your fifth. And then, of course, above there, we've got C sharp, E, A, right? So we've got a 6/3 chord on top of that in our voicing, and then just a little bit of extra push by the first oboe on the top note, right? So it is really lovely, almost a very delicate voicing, I would say. Just lovely the way, and of course it changes around a little bit as the music progresses and so on. And you could work out some of those voicings yourself. They're just really lovely. And they're also marked solely, right? Not in the sense of like playing too far forward of the melody, but he just doesn't want it to be lost. He doesn't want this beautiful color to sit in the background, right? He wants it to be more on the edge, but not protruding, right? So you get this beautiful, rich trade-off between the strings, harps, and winds and brass, as the melody just does its thing in pretty much exactly the way that it had before. Now, you will recall that at the beginning, he had this lovely da 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 da. He had this lovely ritenuto right in here that just really pulled it open, because that is also something in ballroom dancing. Sometimes you slow down the music to really emphasize the motion of the dancers as they sort of come around. Dancing has a bit of phrasing to it too, especially like the kind of very formal ballroom dancing. There were certain steps that the dancers were expected to go through, and so they might phrase their motion in groups of 8 or groups of 4. So if we think of this as 4 bars, 4 bars, 4 bars, going towards the end of the third group of 4 bars, we have this lovely slowdown at the beginning. But here he says, don't do that, without slowing down. And that's because he just knows that the conductor and the orchestra will have seen it the first time, all right, and they'll think, oh yeah, well, we'll just do that every time. No, don't do that every time, he's saying right here. So what's funny, though, is that it's kind of like something, who was it? There was this great virtuoso pianist and teacher. And what he said was, if you make a mistake as you practice, then it might just sit there, like the memory of the mistake in your fingers might sit there almost like a scar, or as a bruise. And your hands might want to do that mistake again and again. In this case, it's a positive thing. You could almost hear the hint of that previous ritenuto in the following reiterations of this melody. It's a wonderful quality, like just the touch of it, almost not even. I mean, it's the suggestion that it's there without actually slowing down. And that is something that is between the expectation of the listener, the execution of the music by the performers. Yeah, and that's the same example of like a musical stain or a musical bruise. Something that was done to change the music quite a ways, and then it's taken away, but the audience still feels it, or the musicians still hint at it, even if they don't actually do it. Okay, one more screen, and then we're going to have a listen to all of this stuff. The music goes by really quickly, so throwing 4 screens at you and then having you listen to the section is really, I don't think, is that much of a burden. Somebody suggested, like whenever you point something out on the score, then you should play like just those bars. And I can't tell you how much that would interrupt the flow of me trying to explain things to you, because then I'd have to come back to it and then check in where we were before and so on and so forth. But it's just really lovely to sit down and to talk about a few pages of score and then to have you listen to it and so on. And you can always re-listen to what I said, any particular points, and maybe take notes or just take a note of where that, what I said at what point in the lecture in the time index, and then just jump back to there and then refer to it and then listen to it again. Okay, so I broke the page right here, and also the rehearsal mark is right here, because this da 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 is becoming a development, right? Remember, this is the second statement in the first A section, right? So this would be like, A1/B, or A1B is where we might be. You might think about it that way, or A1/ or A1, anyways, whatever. So we have this lovely development right in here where this little fragment da 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 is like developed with a sort of call and response, flutes and oboes and clarinet all playing the same exact note, right? This would be like a triple unison, and then right here we've got the horns, right? And just use your transposition skills. This is a G, right? So it's the same exact thing happening down an octave. First horn solo, and these are all really playable notes on a natural horn, right? So you got your E and your C and your B flat. The B flat is just the natural note that shows up there on the 7th partial, right? So it's all real easy to play. This not so easy, the getting this A to speak, but you'll notice that Berlioz scores a lot of A's in his natural horn writing. So that would just be done with like lip pressure and manipulating the right hand in the end of the horn, and possibly even stopping and so on and so forth, just to get the right pitch right in there. So with everybody else playing, the occasional stop note is not going to stand out that much, unless it's like really, really exposed, with just like that instrument being the top instrument in a harmony or something like that. So really, really lovely. Ba-da-da-da-da-dum. Now when we get to the second eighth of this bar, pow, he hits you with poco forte, right? So poco forte is just a little under forte. It is not necessarily mezzo forte, right? It's not a blending tone. It's just drawing back. It's pull your punch slightly on a forte, right? And then, of course, forte for the harps. He's already thinking of balance here. Wants the harps to stand out and really be heard. So it really is effective. You have this harp, the winds coming in right on the downbeat here, dovetailing with the end of the phrase in the first violins, and then pow, right on that second eighth. Finishing up, right? And then when I get to the downbeat here, the strings come in, and then they do it again, right? Getting a little lower this time for our lower winds and horns, just one step lower, but the flute going up the octave, right? So it just feels like it is reaching upwards. Just a very neat trick there. So the these notes are working their way downwards, right? Starting on G sharp and then going to F sharp. If I occasionally neglect saying sharp, it doesn't mean that I don't remember that it is G or G sharp or whatever. I'm just a little sleepy this morning. But notice how the strings are climbing, right? So that, once again, lovely ingenuity by Berlioz. He's got, he has contrary motion in the, in the climbing and descending of different motives. Okay. And then after a while, he gives up the repetition game, the call and response, and he has the winds and horns go to the same rhythm as the strings every other bar, and just lets the first violins kind of get bigger and higher, right? And then he's really setting up the 5 once again, right? So you would think, okay, so now we're going to go back to the 1, but we don't. We go to C natural, and appearing to play an F major, and that will set up the next section. And what is that section? But the trio and the return to the actual E-day fix, not a huge transmogrification of it that is so different that you would not know unless you were really paying attention that the E-day fix is also infused in the main theme and in some of the development materials, right? No, it is such an altered kind of reinterpretation in the A section that this upcoming B section we're about to study, just stating the E-day fix completely on its own, is going to feel like completely fresh material, which of course it is, right? So let's listen for all of these things. That lovely, bubble bum kind of, just really very waltz-like of the winds and brass, and the way the violins have this lovely little call and response, emphasis on the second beat, and some of this, of course, is helping to guide the dancers to what to do next. So if they expect an emphasis on the second beat, one of their steps can be a little stronger on that step, right? Can be a little stronger on that beat. And, just real direct triple unisons and so on, and stacks of octaves. And then, of course, this lovely trading off papa with the restatement, just, whole cloth right from the beginning of the movement. And the glittering harps emerging from the setup and all the lovely contrary motion, middle strings racing upwards with the wind skipping downwards and so on, and this reusing what happened on the previous screen, and just the lovely voicings right in here, the strings and the winds, and then of course right here when he had a perfectly fine setup to go from 5 to 1. He decides not to do that and inject this little episode right in here. So, so listen for the sort of dance between C to B and then B to C in our horns, and then skipping over to the winds and so on and so forth. And it's a lovely little game right in there with the violins playing in contrary motion with the cellos, basically the same little figure, but just starting at different times, and then the pizzicato of the middle strings in between them. So listen to all that stuff. Just such a delightful section of this movement, and a great way for me to wake up in this very sunny morning here in our South Hemisphere summer. And I will see you for the second half of the lecture in just a minute. So as we saw on the previous screen, the music suddenly modulated to F major, kind of a surprise, and the strings, the first violins, sort of worked their way down towards this F here, and here we're seeing that the seconds and the violas are going to measured tremolo, and of course at this speed it is almost unmeasured tremolo. It's just, I think it's of course much more effective for the players to measure it, but it's just so fast. It's such a fast measured tremolo, and I would say, look, just don't do that unless you have a really, really good reason to push your measured tremolo that fast. And here we've got the cellos taking over on that on the melodic duties, and just lovely kind of subsiding downwards melodic motion going all the way down to the fifth of F major, which we end up at, right? Now, there's something about this tone painting that we've got right here. Yes, this is all very carefully worked out as being, part of a very deliberate musical form. However, it is tone painting because, do you remember at the beginning of the movement, we had this kind of darkness going on with the sort of the trembling strings and the cellos and basses kind of emerging from the darkness and playing these gestures with the harps glittering over the top. So it's as if everything that happened before, or happened in between that moment and this moment right there, was just this kind of burst of color and light and energy and motion, right? And then we're kind of going back into the darkness at this point, right? And what sort of sings out over that darkness, what sort of glitters, is the E-Day fix, right? Which is played by one of Berlioz's favorite combinations, oboe plus flute. So he has these two solo espressivo instruments in their best register for blending. That's another thing, is that whenever Berlioz merges the two together, has them double each other melodically, he almost always does it in a way, in the place where the flute is becoming stronger in its middle register, and the oboe is at its most expressive in its sort of upper middle register, right? So that they work together really, really well. So here you got that doubling, and the upper strings are going to continue their sort of frantic trembling. And what do we have return? Do you remember the sort of heartbeat? The da-da, 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 da-da. That's kind of that's returning, but of course with more melodic motion, da-da, da-da, in the cellos and basses. Such a clever idea. and that continues on over the first overall phrase. And it's really you can't really say that it's exactly the same. The register is different. Before it was in C major, right? So that meant that the flute was in a lower place. Right? It was kind of in its lower middle register, and it was doubled by first violins, which is also just in terms of register for both instruments, is a beautiful combination. Now, it actually makes perfect sense to go to F major because that the quality of register of these instruments in doubling is perfect, right? So not only did we have the tone painting and did we have a deliberate kind of overall structure, but we also have the modulation of that music, I would say ultimately going to F major because of the registers of the instruments. One of my tips in 100 Orchestration Tips discusses, the implications of key signature on the registers of instruments, and I could write a book on it, right? I could go back and write some more tips and talk about how this example and that example and so on and so forth, where the composer made a decision, whether intentional or not. I feel that this is very deliberate. He wants to go to F major because of the upper middle register of the flute, and then of course going into the upper register right in here, which I'll talk about in a second. And because that is really the significance. So if you want to know why certain great works maintain or change keys, right, because of certain great solos and great scoring, that's probably why. So here we start off doubling, right? Remember, down a minor third means B flat is going to sound G in our A clarinets. So we start off with unison, right? We're changing to the clarinet, okay? And I'll tell you why in a second, right? It's because he's going to get a different quality moving forward in octaves than he would if it were oboe and flute in octaves. With oboe and clarinet in octaves, there's that slight edge to the sound. It's not as intense as clarinet octaves itself, right? The stacked clarinets in octaves, which you hear the overtone kind of ringing above, and in between, and it's not necessarily unpleasant, but it's very piquant. It sort of digs into the ear a little. So he has a little bit of that quality, but with flute, because flute has a similar timbre. It doesn't have the same overtones, but has a similar kind of square wave timbre. And I mean, of course, Berlioz didn't know anything about the science of waveforms or anything like that, but he knew what he heard, right? So his instincts and his careful ear helped him to make the decision that this octave melody is going to be way brighter with the clarinet underneath it, brighter in that same kind of glittering, semi-hallucinatory feeling of this entire movement, right? Than if he used an oboe. So as the flute reaches higher and higher, right, with the natural flow of the E-day fix, the clarinet below makes a perfect partner. Just really, clarinet is such a great combination with other instruments, especially with a very sensitive player. If you've got your first playing soli with the flute, it's just such a great combination. And when the melody changes to octaves, it's not imperceptible, but it's just so natural that it can go by without being noticed by the listener. Now, if that weren't enough, the lower strings and the violas now set up papa. And while that's going on, we see the violins bringing in fragments of the original melody, of course, changing keys to something compatible with the overall F major tonality of the E-day fix. And yeah, and set up these wonderful conversations, sometimes with the violas coming in for a little bit and setting up a little dialogue between them and the firsts, while the seconds take over the papa of the papa. And then kind of becoming ever more complex and more extenuated as the E-day fix gains in urgency, right? We have the kind of the natural crescendo and the reaching higher and higher of the E-day fix. And of course, the the little asides, the little contrapuntal motion of the of these little comments from the upper strings becomes also more urgent. And he throws in contrary motion between the first and the seconds as well. He just finds every opportunity that he can to make the music more rich, right? Not complex for complexity's sake, but complexity for the sake of the expression of what he's trying to do, the emotionalism, the really rich texture of the ideas, not just of the colors. And of course, it helps the texture of the orchestration as well. And it is really what justifies, in the first place, why you should have these big searching textures in the first place, right? So what, why have music that is intense and towering and intricate and everything else, and beautifully orchestrated, if it doesn't have the kind of intellectual rigor, the intellectual texture as well, to give the orchestration something to hang on to? And that's one of the reasons why, of course, they try to send you through a bunch of harmony lessons and counterpoint and composition and so on before they give you a chance to score something for orchestra, just to make sure that you'll do something that has more intellectual content to it, and rather than just having 150 players just play a big papa with 20 musicians doubling the melody, right? That's as Berlioz shows, even with very small resources, he can just get the most intense motion and emotion out of his musicians. Okay, now here we're going back to tremolo, measured tremolo, with all of our upper strings. And there's still a little bit of motion in the the little chordal structure, a few notes here and there, the violas and so on. Okay, but we're getting to kind of the apex, right? And there's a little bit of diminuendo, because we're setting up the dun da 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 da, which fits in so beautifully with the waltz rhythm, doesn't it? Just the changing from the original cut time version of this to this 3/8, and fits perfectly in. It's as if he is seeing his beautiful gleaming vision waltz out there in a beautiful ball. Maybe he did. Maybe he stalked her. It's like, I hate to say it, like a lot of things that today we kind of take for granted are just really like not the right way to behave. We have kind of evidence that people had, like culturally, they might pursue somebody, and I mean, I don't think Berlioz did anything with malice towards Harriet Smithson. He kind of emotionally blackmailed her into marrying him, though, at the end, which is not such a pleasant kind of a thing to consider. But he may have followed her, let's say, to see what is she doing. Maybe he knew that she was going to appear at some ball, and that was the inspiration for this movement or something. Or maybe it was just his imagination, and he was a very nice person about it otherwise. So, but you can sort of imagine him seeing her at the ball and just seeing the transformation of his longing for her, his idealization of her artistically into this just beautiful waltz, and that is of course what he is sketching here. And the relationship of octaves pretty much is maintained throughout here between our flute and clarinet. And then here it just winds down into this beautiful harmonized resolution. So wonderful. All this activity, all this intensity, all of this intelligence, and of course, like, just the lovely way that the strings are doing their idée fixe, they're doing their sort of little main theme fragments, and that dovetails right into this motion right in here, which is part of the original idée fixe, and just leading towards this very simple ending. And that is given a response by the strings. And just so lovely and intense. This is some of the best scoring. It's just strings, but just so wonderfully done. The harmony here is voiced so exquisitely. It just takes my breath away when I get to this section. The wonderful answer to these very, very simple, these simply scored winds. All right, so I will just leave you there and think about all those things that we discussed. Think about that lovely trade-off I just mentioned. Check out how the little fragments of the main theme interact, work together. Even, they're having little conversations with one another, working in contrary motion sometimes. As the theme gets to that apex, listen for the kind of the return of the measured tremolo, and then how lovely, the lovely way that these little interjections set up this motion right here, and then how Berlioz just pulls back. It's just, we always think of Berlioz as being this real dramatic person, but drama isn't always cannons going off, right? It's also very sensitive understanding of human nature and what's interesting and release, right? It's not all about tension, it's also about release, and Berlioz was a master of that. Now also consider right in here the way the cellos descend down here to underneath the this measured tremolo, and next to nothing, right? That's what this means in French. So yeah, he's it's almost like he's writing niente, right? And this is another thing that romantic composers would imitate after Berlioz. It's very rare that you ever saw any dynamic softer than pianissimo or triple P maybe, but here he's using quadruple P, right? He's really his sense of scope, right? His dynamic scope was quite advanced compared to other orchestrators or other orchestral composers of his day. And then, of course, the way that this beautiful idée fixe comes along and just does its thing. It's just so wonderful. So have a listen to all of that, and I will see you in a day or two for the third of these videos, covering the second movement of Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique.